A German guard picked up the box, turned it over in his hands, checked the seal, glanced at the printed lid showing a cheerful, illustrated street map of a London neighborhood, and set it back down on the pile of approved parcels heading into the camp. Nothing about it looked different from thousands of identical boxes that had already passed through that same checkpoint without incident. He had no way of knowing that folded inside the board, sewn into the felt beneath the dice and tokens, was a silk map printed with the actual roads, rivers, and border crossings a downed pilot would need to walk out of occupied Europe alive, and that the women who had made it had built the entire deception around exploiting a habit they had watched him and every guard like him repeat for months without ever once questioning it. This is the story of the women who worked inside one of the most tightly compartmentalized production lines of the Second World War, manufacturing silk escape maps and hiding them inside ordinary board games destined for German prisoner of war camps, exploiting a specific gap in German inspection procedure that made the entire operation possible. British Military Intelligence Section 9 existed to support Allied personnel trapped behind enemy lines, primarily prisoners of war and airmen shot down over occupied territory who needed practical tools to escape and make their way back to friendly forces. Among the most valuable tools MI9 could provide was accurate mapping, but conventional paper maps presented an obvious problem for anyone attempting a covert escape. Paper crinkled loudly in silence, tore easily in wet conditions, and disintegrated after repeated folding and unfolding across days or weeks of travel through hostile territory. MI9's solution was to print maps on silk instead, a material that folded compactly into almost no space, made virtually no sound when handled, and survived exposure to water and repeated handling in ways paper never could. The technical challenge was substantial. Printing detailed cartographic information onto fabric required specialized techniques completely different from standard paper printing, and doing it at the volume MI9 needed meant establishing a dedicated production operation capable of producing thousands of maps covering dozens of different escape routes across occupied Europe. The women who staffed this production line worked under conditions of extraordinary secrecy, often without full knowledge of how their individual tasks connected to the broader operation, a compartmentalization strategy that limited what any single worker could reveal even under interrogation if the operation were ever compromised. Printing on silk required adapting engraving and ink formulation techniques so that fine cartographic detail, road networks, river systems, elevation markings, and border crossings could be reproduced with enough clarity to remain readable after the fabric had been folded and refolded dozens of times. The ink itself needed specific properties, remaining flexible enough not to crack along fold lines while staying permanently fixed to the silk fibers even after exposure to sweat, rain, or the general wear of being carried against skin for days at a time. Workers tested printed samples by repeatedly folding them along the same creases, checking whether the image degraded, then adjusting ink formulation and printing pressure until a map could survive the kind of handling a real escape attempt would actually involve. Once the maps themselves were successfully produced, MI9 faced an equally difficult problem getting them into prisoner of war camps without German censors intercepting them. Every parcel sent to Allied prisoners passed through German inspection, and camp authorities were specifically alert to the possibility that seemingly innocent care packages might contain contraband. Books were checked for hollowed pages, food tins were checked for false bottoms, clothing was checked for items sewn into linings. MI9 needed a delivery method that German inspectors would categorically dismiss as too mundane to warrant careful scrutiny, and the answer came from an unlikely source, the British board game manufacturer that produced the licensed British edition of Monopoly. The specific detail that made this operation work was not simply that board games seemed innocent. It was a precise, repeated observation about how German camp censors actually processed incoming parcels under the volume of mail moving through their checkpoints. Board games arrived packaged, sealed, and manufactured in bulk by a recognized commercial company, and censors handling hundreds of parcels a day developed a practical shortcut for managing that volume, treating manufactured goods from established companies as inherently lower risk than handmade or individually wrapped items that seemed more likely to have been tampered with after leaving a factory. Censors checked board games for the obvious, whether the box had been reopened and resealed, whether the packaging looked disturbed, but they consistently did not disassemble the game boards themselves, because doing so would have required destroying a manufactured product based on nothing more than general suspicion, at a volume that would have made full disassembly of every incoming game physically impossible within their processing capacity. This specific procedural gap, not a general assumption that games were harmless, was the single vulnerability the entire operation depended on, and the women producing these items understood precisely how to exploit it. Silk maps were concealed inside the game boards themselves, folded flat and sealed beneath the outer playing surface during manufacturing, positioned so that the game remained fully playable and structurally identical to a standard retail edition if a censor did choose to handle or even lightly flex the board. Additional items, small compasses, files, and printed foreign currency were hidden within other game components, tucked into hollowed sections of wooden pieces, or sealed within the game's cardboard box construction in ways designed to survive a cursory external inspection without altering the game's weight or feel in any way that might draw attention. Every element of the concealment had to account for the fact that a suspicious censor might pick up and shake a box, might flex a board slightly, might weigh a package against an identical known sample, and the production process had to ensure that none of these casual checks would reveal anything irregular. This required an unusual combination of manufacturing precision and psychological insight from the women involved in production, understanding not just how to physically conceal an object, but how to anticipate the specific, limited scrutiny a censor working through hundreds of parcels a day would realistically apply, and designing the concealment method around the boundaries of that scrutiny rather than around a theoretical worst-case inspection that would never actually occur given the practical volume constraints camp censors operated under. Workers assembling these items needed to internalize an accurate model of enemy behavior under institutional time pressure, then engineer a physical product specifically calibrated to pass within those real constraints, a task that demanded far more analytical judgment than simply hiding an object well. Special parcels containing these modified games were distributed to prisoners through carefully managed channels, sometimes routed through fictitious charitable organizations established specifically to give MI9 a controllable distribution path that would not draw suspicion back toward any single legitimate group repeatedly sending packages to the same prisoners. This distribution layer added another dimension of operational security on top of the physical concealment itself, ensuring that even if a single compromised parcel were somehow discovered, the broader network responsible for its production and distribution would remain protected from exposure. The operation's effectiveness is difficult to measure with precise numbers because its entire design depended on leaving no trace. But historical estimates place the number of prisoners who successfully used MI9 supplied escape materials, including silk maps distributed through this and similar concealment methods, in the tens of thousands across the war. Every successful escape depended on a chain of production decisions made months earlier by workers who never met the prisoners who would eventually use their work, who had no way of confirming whether any specific map they printed and concealed ever actually reached someone who needed it. and who operated under strict secrecy that meant even close family members often had no idea what kind of production work they were actually doing throughout the war. What makes this operation particularly striking as a piece of wartime engineering is how completely its success depended on precise empirical observation of enemy behavior rather than on any dramatic single act of daring. The entire concealment method existed because someone had studied exactly how German sensors processed incoming parcels, identified the specific procedural shortcut that volume forced them to adopt, and then designed a production process meticulously calibrated to exploit that exact gap without triggering the kinds of scrutiny that would have closed it. It was not luck. It was applied behavioral analysis translated directly into manufacturing specifications, executed by women whose individual contributions, hidden by design even from each other, made possible one of the most successful and least visible support operations of the entire war. Every dusty page still hides a name history forgot to remember. Follow Iron Women Archives, and let's keep prying those pages open, one forgotten woman at a time.